I have a very basic Next.js project setup right here. I have everything going for me. I have a button component and I'm using it in my page. You can see right here that I have a button component that is being used in a page. The thing that I don't want is that I don't want there to be a button component right here, which means I don't want a button component to be right here. Instead of this button tag, I want this button component to return its first child, which is a link component. What I mean is that instead of this button right here, I want this tag to be here. That's it. At the same time, I want full control over this behavior, so I don't want to be making any changes to this. I want to be able to add a prop over here and immediately change the behavior of the component, whether to return its first child or whether to return a button component. How would you do that, right? There is a library from RadixUI. It's called React Slot. When you replace the button with this slot component, notice what happens. When you replace this button with the slot component, the button tag, this means that when you use this button will be replaced by the slot component. Now you might be thinking, okay, what does that do? What does the mysterious slot component return? Which tag does it return, right? The thing is, this slot component doesn't return any tags. It returns its first child to itself. So instead of the button component right here, this button component will return a slot component, and the slot component will return its first child, which is this link component. And the thing is that this link component returns an A tag as JSX. So what you will notice right here is that instead of the button, we have an A tag. Let me show it to you side by side. When we use a button tag, we have a button now. We have a button inside which there's an A tag. I want this button component to vanish, and I want all of its props, which is this class attribute, to be passed on to its first child, which this slot component also takes care of. It's a beautiful component that it's a beautiful abstraction that you should be using in your Next.js or React project in general. But the thing is that when I discovered this component, I was like, okay, that's cool, but this is someone else's library. I should know how this works too, right? I should be able to think like that. I should be able to create these things. I felt pretty inadequate. Kind of ruined my entire day. So I actually jumped into the library itself. I went to RadixUI. I went to React Slot. I went to its first module and I checked it out. And after a lot of consideration, I realized that you cannot make a video out of this because first of all, you don't understand it more than 50%. The basic gist of this video is to let you know that this came from a human mind. So you should be able to make abstractions like these too. You should be able to come up with ideas like these too. So I'm going to kind of recreate a very vague and very inadequate version of this slot component. This slot component takes care of a lot of things. It takes care of the class names. It merges all the class names together. So basically, if I give this different class names, it takes that class name, it merges it with this class name, it takes all of its props, it merges it with the props. So it does a lot of things right that you want your component to do. But when we create our own component, I think you'll get a little bit of a confidence boost that, okay, I can do this too. And if I'm wrong, please feel free to comment down below. I am more than happy to accept my mistake. But this is what I found out, so I'm sharing it with you. Let's create a test slot component. Alright, let's start by thinking what I want this slot component to do. Let's remove the old slot component. Let's replace it with a button, remove that. What do I want this to do? I want to be able to replace my button tag with it. So what I want it to do is that take its first child and return it as itself. So when I use it here, I want it not to return a button component, but its first child, which is the link component. So to get a child, I think we should try and get it from the props. So we will use props. Right now, let's not bother with TypeScript and return the JSON.stringify props. So we actually know what this props does, right? Let's comment this out and let's use the test slot. What I'm doing here is I'm taking the props of this slot component. and then I'm returning the JSON version of those props. So right here you will notice that the children, okay, let's format it. Over here we have an object of the props which has children, which has another set of props which has the href tag, which is this. Okay, so right now we are thinking about this component right here. This component has a child which is an a tag, and this a tag has a child which is the redirect string. Right here is the same thing. This component has children, which is this particular component, and this component in turn has another props where the child is the redirect, which is true. So now we have access to all of its children. Now instead of this JSON, I want to return its first child. So I'm going to get the children from the props. Then I'm going to clone this element. It's not clone, it's clone element. So what clone element does, it takes the children, it takes those props, and it creates a new element. So if I give it right here, so what is happening here is that this test slot is returning its own child with its own props. Look over here. The thing is, we are using a test slot component around the link component, which is an a tag itself. But there is nothing around the a tag over here because we are returning its own child as itself, if that makes any sense. You also might notice that this a tag doesn't have any new props because we haven't passed any new props to the parent component. Let's pass it some new props. Let's have a class name of. Now that we've added this class name, you might also have noticed that the styling has changed over here. That wouldn't have been possible if the classes weren't passed down from the parent element to the child element. And all of these classes are present on the a tag itself. It's not on some other component like this component. This component is just rendering its own first child. Any prop that you pass to this parent component, for example, some prop, sure, it will be passed on to this component and it will be returned instead of itself. So test slot will return the first link component. If I were to use maybe a pre-component right here instead of a link component, this test slot now returns the pre-component instead of itself and passes all of its props to this new pre-component. That's what should happen over here. This is how basically what the gist is. And now I want full control on this behavior. I don't want to be able to be changing this every time. All right, I want this to happen this time, but I don't want it to happen the other time. So how do we integrate this with our pre-existing reusable button component? And how do we gain full control over it? Well, instead, so if I have a link right here, which has an href and this, I don't want to use this test slot component again and again. I want to be able to use a button component whenever I want to, and I want to be using a test slot component whenever I want to, because sometimes I might want to wrap the link component with a button component. Sometimes I might not want to wrap the button component with the link component with a button component and still pass all of its classes to the child element. How do we control this behavior? Well, we can go to the button component. We can say, all right, in the JavaScript section of the component, we can say const comp is equal to if a certain prop is true. So let's say asChild, if this prop is true, return the slot component, f slot, and if it's false, then return a button component. Now let's take a asChild component, which will be false initially, and instead of this button, let's use the comp. Now the flow that is taking place here is that now we don't have to wrap each and every element with a test slot component. We can use our button directly, as we were earlier. We can use our button directly and at the same time pass all of its classes to the link component and replace this button component with this link component. In this case, the asChild prop is false. So this comp will be replaced by a button component, and this will in the end be a button tag. This button tag will wrap the link component, which is an a tag. So over here you will notice that we have maintained the style of the component. We've not lost the style. At the same time, it is still wrapping the button, the link component, but you don't want this behavior. So as we wanted control, we can just add the asChild prop, and the button vanishes and all of its classes get transferred onto this first child. That's it. That's how everything works. I would recommend, though, don't do this yourself. Let the professionals take care of it. It's just a matter of knowing what your tools are. Someone else made the tool, sure, but you should know how they work. That's pretty much it. That's all I wanted to show you right here. You can do it yourself. It will throw an error in other cases. If you add another prop here, it will throw an error because you haven't handled it. You are not a professional. You didn't code the RadixUI React slot component. So that's the gist of this video. Bye bye.